We are at Sloss Furnaces, National Historic Landmark, the only 20th century blast furnace in the nation being preserved and interpreted as a museum of industry. A blast furnace is a cylindrical shell used for making iron. Ingredients are loaded into the top, heated to very hot temperatures, and the iron and the waste product called slag is released from the bottom of the furnace and sent into channels to make bars of iron. The facility first opened in 1881, made its first iron in 1882, and run to 1970 when air pollution regulations and the demand for pig iron decreased, and it closed officially in 1971. Pig iron is cast iron, foundry iron. It's all really the same thing, but the reason why it's called pig iron is simply from the olden days, the pattern that they would pour this iron in. It would run through channels that they would call sows and into the pig iron molds, which they said looked like piglets suckling at the mother sow, hence the name pig iron. James Withers Sloss, it was from Athens, Alabama. He was an Irishman, a businessman. He was known for making, business choices that generated lots of revenue. He invested heavily in railroads, in mining, and eventually come to Birmingham to invest not only in mining and railroads, but also in blast furnaces. Birmingham was important for many reasons to Sloss and also other entrepreneurs who came to Birmingham. Everything that you need to make iron is here in Birmingham, so all these entrepreneurs, just converged onto Birmingham to invest in mining and blast furnaces because you had everything right here and it was easy to turn that into profit. You need 3 ingredients to make iron. So iron is derived from iron ore, coal, and limestone, and here you actually process your coal into an ingredient called coke, which burns much hotter than coal. So iron is made from iron ore, coke, and limestone. So your iron, once it is poured here at Sloss, and it's basically in the older days it was like 100 to 150 pound blocks. Eventually they become much smaller to around 30 to 60 pounds. So once these blocks left Sloss, they would go to other foundries to be melted back down and turned into cast iron pipes or cookware, machine parts, or it went to the steel mills to be turned into steel. Railroads were essential in Birmingham's success. Most industrial cities, or even antebellum cities, they are built around waterways. That's going to bring in things that you need and take finished products out. Well, in Birmingham we have no waterways, so railroads were essential in getting all the ingredients in and the finished product out. So without those railroads we wouldn't have a link to all the port cities and other places that needed our iron. Sloss is basically encompassed by railroads because not only do we need ingredients to come in through tracks like this, but we need it to go out on tracks right outside of the site here. So we are encompassed with railroads bringing in those essential ingredients and carrying the products out. You still hear them today as they make their way in and out of the city. This is a new South city, solely devoted to industry rather than agriculture like in your antebellum days. And Birmingham was the prime place to do this because you had everything that you needed to make iron, and people poured into the city, hence why we're called the Magic City, because the population grew so fast because people come here to find work, to build businesses, and it was just a huge contributing factor to why Birmingham became eventually the premier southern city. At Sloss's prime, you would actually have about 400 to 450 men total. Now that is a huge decrease to the earlier years, because by the prime time of Sloss during World War I and World War II, basically, they had mechanized, and so your labor force was cut in half because of the mechanization period. When it first began, you would have like 800 men, but as you got machinery to replace the work of men, your workforce of course, will decrease. So about 450 men or so during its prime. We are actually standing in the #1 casting shed, where you can also see the #1 blast furnace here. This is the soul of your operation right here. This is where your iron flows from your furnace. You see the base of the furnace. You see a huge pipe that is wrapped around. That is where superheated air is being blasted into the furnace, which is full of your iron ore, your coke, and your limestone. Your air is going in at the base, which is super stoking your fire to 3,600 degrees. And when it's ready to tap the furnace, about every 4 hours, you open up the iron notch. In other words, tapping out the plug that has the notch plugged in. You tap out that plug, the iron just flows out, just explodes. There's tremendous pressure behind your iron notch, and the iron just explodes out. This is where the channels were dug, where it received the name pig iron, because you would have all these long channels flowing down through this foundry sand, where you would have your sows and then your molds, your smaller molds for the pig bars, and it would just steam and flow down through here. And First Avenue Viaduct is actually out to the right, and people would stop along this viaduct and they would watch the iron and the slag being poured all through here, because it was just steamy and fiery, and just a really exceptional scene to come over the viaduct and see all this iron and slag flow. But again, this is just your lifeline here. This is where your iron is made, and then it would leave here and be shipped out all over the world. We are currently standing in the blower engine room. Now, this is what we refer to as the lungs of the furnace. Now, to get your intense temperature, 3,600 degrees, you must blast superheated air into the base of your furnace to reach that temperature you need. And that air was generated in this building here. Now, what we're looking at now, these structures and steam engines were installed between 1896 and 1899, and the building was actually built around them in 1902. So you have huge 20-foot diameter flywheels that are revolving 37 times every single minute, and that is what's pushing that generated air that's been generated and compressed up and out of the building, where it could be heated and then blast into the base of your furnace. So as far as we know, this is the only type of machinery still standing intact from this period in this country. So it's really exceptional machinery that was very important in the iron making process. You needed that hot air generated constantly. You needed 2 pounds of air per ton of iron. So it was a place that constantly ran, and at Sloss your labor was 2/3 African American. It was very much a hierarchy like you would see, in fact on a plantation. They called this the iron plantation because you had an all-white management team and an all-black labor gang, and your salaries were adjusted accordingly. A African American man could not have a job that was considered a white man's job, and vice versa. So it was a very rigid system, but a system no less that was necessary and run constantly for 90 years here.
What would it have felt like down here?
It would have been extremely hot in here, because in this bigger room, in the older part, you have 8 steam engines running constantly. It was so hot in here, in fact, that workers would actually germinate seeds, and they would take them home to the Sloss quarters to their wives. You could have a full-grown tomato plant in a few weeks because of the intense heat. Now, in the newer part, these turbo blowers that you see here, they were installed between 1949 and 1950. And the steam power that powered them are up underneath the ground, therefore heating the floor, heating the bricks, heating the ceiling. And in these newer parts, it could be anywhere to 140 degrees, especially during the summertime when it is obviously very hot in Birmingham, Alabama. So it would be extremely, extremely hot in this blower engine room. We are currently looking at the elevated stock trestle. Again, going back to the importance of railroads here in Birmingham, everything arrived and left by way of train. And this is how the raw ingredients got to Sloss. Basically, they would come in through the main railroads and up to the elevated stock trestle here. And then from this point, your raw ingredients would be dumped into bins that would be up underneath this track here, because the recipe, so to speak, that would go into the furnace was very, very specific. So they couldn't just mix up ingredients. They had to keep them sorted, and they had to keep them in the correct quantities, and then from here they would be weighed and then sent to the top of the furnace by way of a pulley system. You have your stock cars bringing up ingredients by the ton, and they would just keep that very specific ratio going in your blast furnace, and it was continuously loaded because you had to tap your furnace about every 4 hours, so you constantly want fresh ingredients up in the top of your furnace so you can always ensure that you'll have iron every 4 hours, because otherwise you would cut into your profit, your iron making, and you always want constant supplies of iron being made. Sloss actually started to meet its demise around the 1960s, because you actually have other synthetic materials and stuff that was coming on board that was replacing the use of cast iron or foundry iron, mainly through the use of plastic. A lot of Sloss ironworks were making cast iron pipes, and when it became plastic pipes, that started kind of decreasing the demand for pig iron. And then you have the Clean Air Act of 1970, which is really going to be basically the last straw. If you do not have a demand for pig iron and you're not selling your iron as much, you do not have the funds to overhaul your site to make it more efficient and less pollutant. So that, coupled with the Clean Air Act of 1970, basically led to the closing of the site in 1971. Sloss's story is very important to tell. Not only is it the only 20th century blast furnace in the nation being preserved, but it's the stories, it's the heritage of what we are preserving. This is the reason why we have people here today that have continued to stay here. They can trace their roots back to their family coming over to be coal miners or to work in blast furnaces. So it's really, not only a story of industry, but a story of people and why people are where they are today.